Some moments change everything, and for Theodore Buck Rawlings, that moment came on the coldest night of his life. There she was, a tiny girl, no more than 6, shivering against a snow-covered wall, forgotten by the world like yesterday's newspaper. Buck was a lonely old cowboy who had given up on caring about anyone. He'd lost his wife years ago and hadn't spoken to his son in over a decade. Walking past that little girl should have been easy, but when she looked up at him with those tired eyes, something inside his frozen heart cracked open. He couldn't leave her there to die in the snow. So he picked her up, carried her home, and discovered that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. But would this broken man and this abandoned child really be enough to keep each other alive through the brutal winter ahead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana wilderness, driving snow through every crack and crevice of Buck Rawlings' cabin. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth he'd built with his own hands 23 years ago, when Martha was still alive and the world held promise instead of just memories. The cabin sat 15 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Falls, nestled in a valley where the pine trees grew thick enough to break the worst of the winter storms. Buck set the child down gently on the worn leather sofa that had been Martha's favorite spot for reading. The little girl, Katie, she'd whispered when he'd asked her name, clutched a tattered doll to her chest. The doll's face was nearly rubbed away from loving, its dress patched with mismatched fabric. It was clear this small treasure was all she owned in the world. "You hungry, little one?" Buck asked, his voice rusty from months of talking only to his horses and the occasional traveler. Katie nodded but didn't speak, her enormous brown eyes following his every movement with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust too quickly. Buck moved to the kitchen area, grateful for the supplies he'd stocked before the worst of winter set in. He'd lived through enough Montana winters to know they could stretch on for months, turning the world into a frozen wasteland where the unprepared didn't survive. His hands, weathered and scarred from decades of ranch work, fumbled with unfamiliar tenderness as he prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. While the food warmed, Buck studied the child in the firelight. She couldn't weigh more than 40 pounds, soaking wet, and her dress, once blue, now faded to the color of storm clouds, hung loose on her small frame. Her blonde hair was matted and dirty, but even in her bedraggled state, there was something dignified about the way she sat, straight-backed on the sofa, her doll positioned carefully in her lap. Theodore Buck Rawlings had been many things in his 63 years: cowboy, ranch hand, husband, father, but never had he been responsible for someone so young, so vulnerable. His own son, Thomas, had left home at 18 after a bitter argument that still echoed in Buck's mind, like thunder from a distant storm. That had been over 10 years ago, and Buck had convinced himself he was better off alone. Martha's journal lay on the mantelpiece, its leather cover worn smooth by his hands during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. She'd written in it every day for 15 years, documenting their life together with the careful script of a woman who'd been educated beyond her circumstances. After she died of fever 5 years ago, Buck had read every page until he could recite her words by heart. The journal had become his anchor to better times, a reminder that he'd once been capable of love and worthy of being loved in return. "Here you go," Buck said softly, placing a bowl of warm beans and a piece of cornbread on the small table beside the sofa. Katie looked up at him with those serious eyes, then carefully set her doll aside and began to eat with the focused intensity of someone who'd known real hunger. Buck settled into his chair across from her, nursing a cup of coffee that had grown bitter from sitting too long on the stove. The cabin felt different with another person in it, smaller somehow, but also more alive than it had been in years. The silence that had been his companion for so long now seemed heavy with unasked questions. "You got family somewhere, Katie?" he asked gently, not wanting to push but needing to understand how a child so young had ended up alone in a blizzard. Katy paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "No family," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Just me and Rosie." She touched the doll's worn fabric dress. "Mama and Papa went to heaven when the mine fell down." Buck's chest tightened. The Brennan mine collapse had happened 6 months ago, killing 15 men and leaving behind a town full of widows and orphans. He'd heard about it from Doc Henley when he'd made his quarterly trip to Cedar Falls for supplies, but he hadn't thought much about the children left behind. Now, looking at Katy's thin face, the tragedy felt personal in a way that made his throat burn. "How long you been on your own?" he asked. "Since the bad place," Katy said, then seemed to catch herself, as if she'd said something she shouldn't. She took another bite of beans and didn't elaborate. Buck didn't press. He'd learned long ago that some stories came out in their own time, like wildflowers that couldn't be forced to bloom. Instead, he busied himself adding wood to the fire and checking the windows to make sure they were sealed tight against the storm. The wind continued its assault on the cabin throughout the evening. Buck made up a bed for Katy on the sofa, piling it high with quilts that Martha had sewn during the early years of their marriage. Each stitch had been placed with care, creating patterns of stars and flowers that brought color to the rough-hewn interior of their home. As Katy settled under the covers with her doll tucked close, Buck found himself remembering another small figure in this same cabin. Thomas had been about Katy's age when they'd first moved here, full of energy and questions, always underfoot while Buck worked on building their life in the wilderness. Where had that eager little boy gone? When had the distance between them grown so wide that Buck couldn't see across it anymore? "Mr. Buck?" Katy's voice was small in the darkness, illuminated only by the dying fire. "What is it, sweetheart? Are you going to send me back to the bad place?" The question hit Buck like a physical blow. He'd faced down rattlesnakes and wild horses, weathered blizzards and droughts, but something in Katy's voice, the resignation mixed with desperate hope, nearly brought him to his knees. "No," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "You're safe here." Katy didn't respond, but Buck could hear her breathing, slowly steady as sleep finally claimed her. He sat in his chair by the fire long into the night, watching the flames dance and thinking about the weight of promises made to children. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Buck woke before sunrise, as was his habit, and found Katy already awake, sitting quietly on the sofa with her doll. She'd folded the quilts with careful precision, creating a neat stack that spoke of someone who'd been taught to be grateful for small kindnesses. "Morning," Buck said, moving to restart the fire. "Sleep all right?" "Yes, sir, thank you for the warm bed." Her politeness had an adult quality that made Buck's heart ache. Children shouldn't have to be so careful, so grateful for basic kindness. They should expect it as their birthright. Buck prepared breakfast, eggs from his small flock of chickens and more cornbread, while Katy sat quietly, still as a statue, except for her eyes, which tracked his movements with keen intelligence. She was taking in everything, memorizing the layout of the cabin, the routines of her new environment. It was the behavior of someone who'd learned to adapt quickly to new situations. After breakfast, Buck showed Katy around the cabin, pointing out where things were kept and explaining how the stove worked, how to add wood to the fire, where the water pump was located. She listened intently, asking occasional questions that revealed a sharp mind despite her young age. "You know your letters?" Buck asked as they stood before Martha's small collection of books. "Some," Katy said. "Mama taught me before she went to heaven." Buck pulled down a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, one of Martha's favorites. "Maybe we'll read some together." Martha always said stories made the long winters pass quicker. For the first time since he'd found her, Katy smiled, just a small upturn of her lips, but it transformed her entire face. In that moment, Buck caught a glimpse of the child she might become if given the chance to feel safe again. The day passed quietly, but as evening approached, Buck knew he couldn't put off the inevitable trip to town. His supplies were running low, and Dr. Henley needed to examine Katie to make sure she hadn't suffered any lasting harm from her exposure to the cold. More importantly, if Katie was truly an orphan from the mine collapse, there would be records, people looking for her. Buck hitched up his wagon, laying extra blankets in the bed for Katie's comfort. The road to Cedar Falls was treacherous in winter, winding through mountain passes where the snow drifted deep and the wind could blind a man in minutes. But Buck knew every turn, every dangerous stretch, and his horses were sure-footed and strong. Katie sat beside him on the wagon seat, wrapped in one of Martha's heavy coats that nearly swallowed her small frame. She watched the frozen landscape pass by, with wide eyes occasionally pointing to a deer or a hawk soaring overhead. Her wonder at the natural world reminded Buck of Thomas at that age, when everything was new and magical. Cedar Falls wasn't much to look at, a collection of wooden buildings huddled around a main street that turned to mud in spring and froze, solid in winter. But it was civilization of a sort, and Buck found himself oddly nervous as they approached the outskirts of town. He hadn't brought a child here since Thomas was young, and he wondered what people would think about the gruff old widower suddenly appearing with a little girl. The first stop was Doc Henley's office, a tidy building next to the pharmacy that also served as the closest thing Cedar Falls had to a hospital. Doc Henley was a good man, a former army surgeon who'd settled in Montana after the war and devoted himself to caring for miners, ranchers, and their families. Buck Rawlings, Doc, Henley said as they entered his office, his eyebrows rising at the sight of Katie. Wasn't expecting to see you until spring. Found this little one in the storm last night, Buck explained, his hand resting gently on Katie's shoulder. Wanted to make sure she's all right. Doc Henley, a slight man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, knelt down to Katie's level. "Hello there, young lady. I'm Dr. Henley. Would it be all right if I took a look at you, just to make sure you're healthy?" Katie nodded, and Buck was struck again by her composure. Most children would be frightened or crying, but Katie faced each new situation with the steady courage of someone much older. The examination revealed what Buck had suspected. Katie was undernourished and had been living rough for some time, but she was fundamentally healthy. Doc Henley's face was grim as he spoke quietly with Buck, while Katie looked at the medical instruments with curious fascination. "She's been without proper care for weeks, maybe months," Doc said. "And see these marks on her wrists? Old rope burns. Someone tied this child up, Buck." Buck's jaw tightened. "Any idea where she might have come from?" "I've got suspicions. There's been talk about the territorial orphanage over in Millfield. Rumors of children going missing, of cruel treatment. But proving anything against a government institution, that's another matter entirely." Before Buck could respond, the office door opened, and Mrs. Polk bustled in, bringing with her the scent of peppermint and the energy of someone who made it her business to know everyone else's business. Margaret Polk ran the general store with her husband and served as the unofficial keeper of all local gossip. "Theodore Rawlings," she said, her sharp eyes immediately finding Katie. "And who might this be?" "Katie," Buck said simply, his tone discouraging further questions, but Mrs. Polk was not easily discouraged. "Katie what? Where are her people? Buck, you can't just—" "Can't what, Margaret?" Buck's voice carried a warning that made Mrs. Polk step back slightly. "Can't help a child in need?" The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Katie pressed closer to Buck's side, and he could feel her trembling slightly. Without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders, a gesture that felt both foreign and completely natural. "Now, Buck," Doc Henley said diplomatically, "Margaret's just concerned about proper procedures. If Katie here is an orphan, there are legal considerations." "Legal considerations can wait until after Christmas," Buck said firmly. "Right now, she needs care and safety. Everything else can be sorted out later." Mrs. Polk's expression softened slightly as she looked at Katie's small face. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in making sure she's fed and warm. Lord knows we've got enough children in need these days." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Mitchell, a tall man with prematurely grey hair and the steady demeanor of someone who'd seen enough trouble to last several lifetimes. His presence changed the atmosphere in the room immediately, and Buck felt Katie tense against his side. "Afternoon, folks," Sheriff Mitchell said, his eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. "Doc, Mrs. Polk, Buck." He nodded to each in turn, then looked down at Katie. "And you must be the little girl I've been hearing about." Buck's blood ran cold. "Hearing about from who?" Sheriff Mitchell's expression was carefully neutral. "Seems there's been some inquiries about a missing child. Federal marshals were through here yesterday, asking questions about a girl who escaped from the territorial orphanage." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Buck felt Katie's small hand slip into his, her fingers ice-cold despite the warmth of the doctor's office. Everything he'd feared was coming to pass. Katie would be taken away, sent back to whatever hell she'd escaped from, and he would be alone again in his empty cabin. But as he looked down at her upturned face, saw the trust in her eyes, despite her fear, Buck knew he couldn't let that happen. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. "Sheriff," Buck said quietly, "I think we need to talk." Sheriff Mitchell's office was a small, cramped space behind the jail cells, heated by a pot-bellied stove that struggled against the Montana cold. Buck sat across from the sheriff's desk, Katie perched on his lap with her doll clutched tight. The sheriff's badge caught the lamplight as he leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on a stack of official papers. "Buck, I've known you for 15 years, Sheriff Mitchell began, his voice heavy with reluctance. "You're a good man, and after what you went through losing Martha, well, nobody would fault you for wanting to help this child." Buck said nothing, just tightened his arms protectively around Katie. She hadn't spoken since they'd left Doc Henley's office, but he could feel the tension in her small body. "The thing is," the sheriff continued, "I've got federal marshals breathing down my neck about a girl who matches Katie's description. She escaped from the Millfield Territorial Orphanage 3 weeks ago during a transport to another facility." "What in kind of transport?" Buck asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Sheriff Mitchell pulled a wanted poster from the stack of papers. The crude sketch bore little resemblance to the child in Buck's arms, but the description was close enough. "Says here she was being transferred to a private placement in California, a wealthy family looking to adopt." Buck studied the poster, noting what wasn't said as much as what was. "Funny how they don't mention why a 6-year-old girl would run away from people trying to help her. Buck, and funny how they're offering a $50 reward for her return. That's a lot of money for one small child." Sheriff Mitchell's jaw worked silently for a moment. "I've heard rumors about Millfield. Nothing I can prove, but let's just say I wouldn't want my own daughter in that place." Katie shifted in Buck's lap, and when she spoke, her voice was so quiet they had to strain to hear her. "The bad man hurt the other children. He said if we told anyone, worse things would happen." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Buck felt rage rise in his chest, hot and fierce. Sheriff Mitchell's face had gone pale, and his hands clenched into fists on his desk. "Katie," the sheriff said gently, "can you tell us about this bad man?" Katie shook her head violently. "He said I was going to the pretty house where rich people would make me be good, but Jenny told me what really happens to girls at the pretty house. She said they make you do things." Katie's voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Buck's world tilted. He'd suspected abuse at the orphanage, but this was something far darker. "Who's Jenny?" "She was my friend. She tried to run away before, but they brought her back. She got sick after the pretty house and died." Katie's matter-of-fact delivery made the horror even worse. Sheriff Mitchell stood abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders rigid. When he turned back, his face was set with grim determination. "Buck, officially I'm supposed to hold Katie here until the federal marshals return tomorrow. Officially, you're harboring a fugitive ward of the territorial government, and unofficially, the sheriff met Buck's eyes. Unofficially, I don't see so well in snowstorms, and it just so happens we're expecting a big one tonight." He walked to his coat rack and pulled on his heavy winter gear. "I need to make my rounds. Probably take me a good hour, maybe two if the weather's bad as I expect." Buck understood. He stood carefully, settling Katie more securely in his arms. "Sheriff, if anyone asks, I never saw you," Sheriff Mitchell said firmly. "And Buck? That child needs to disappear for a while, somewhere the Federals can't find her. You understand?" Buck nodded. He understood perfectly. Katie wasn't just running from an orphanage anymore, she was running from something that would destroy her innocence, and possibly her life. 20 minutes later, Buck was loading supplies into his wagon behind the general store, while Mrs. Polk bustled about, filling sacks with flour, beans, salt, and other necessities. She worked in uncharacteristic silence, but Buck caught her wiping her eyes when she thought no one was looking. "You take care of that little girl," she said finally, pressing a cloth bag into his hands. "That's candy and some new hair ribbons. Every little girl should have pretty ribbons." "Mrs. Polk, don't you say nothing, Theodore Rawlings. Just promise me you'll keep her safe." Buck promised, though he wasn't sure how he was going to keep that promise. The federal marshals would return, and when they found Katie gone, they'd search every cabin, every hideout within 100 miles. His own place would be the first they'd check. The ride back to the cabin was treacherous. Snow had begun falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured the trail and made the horses nervous. Katie rode in silence, wrapped in blankets and pressed against Buck's side for warmth. Occasionally, she would look back over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. "We're going to be all right," Buck told her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "Where will we go?" Katie asked. Buck had been thinking about that. His cabin was too obvious, too easy to find, but there were other places. Old mining, camps, abandoned settlements, caves in the high country that few people knew about, places where a man and a child could disappear for weeks or even months if necessary. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere they can't find us." Back at the cabin, Buck worked quickly to gather essential supplies. Food, blankets, ammunition, medical supplies, and Martha's journal. He couldn't leave that behind. Katie helped without being asked, packing her few belongings and the small bag of candy from Mrs. Polk. As Buck loaded his pack, he caught sight of Katie standing before the fireplace, staring at Martha's journal. "That belonged to my wife," he explained. "She wrote in it every day." What did she write about? Life, our dreams, our worries, the things that mattered to her. Buck paused in his packing. "She always said that writing things down made them real, made them last." Katie nodded solemnly. "Mama used to tell me stories about before I was born. She said stories keep people alive in our hearts." The simple wisdom of it struck Buck like lightning. This child, who had lost everything and faced horrors no child should know, still understood something profound about love and memory. A sound outside made them both freeze, horses approaching through the snow. Buck moved quickly to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. 3 riders were making their way up the trail to his cabin, their dark forms barely visible in the swirling snow. "Federal marshals," Buck breathed. They were too early, arriving ahead of schedule. Katie appeared at his side, her face pale but determined. "What do we do?" Buck's mind raced. The cabin had a back door that opened onto a trail leading up into the mountains. If they moved quickly and quietly, they could reach the trees before the marshals surrounded the building, but it would mean leaving everything behind and venturing into a blizzard with inadequate supplies. "Katie," Buck said, kneeling. "To her level, remember what I told you about being brave?" She nodded. "Well, this is one of those times. We're going to walk out that back door, nice and quiet, and we're going to disappear into the woods like ghosts. Can you do that?" "Yes, Papa Buck." The word hit him like a physical blow. Papa. No one had called him that since Thomas was small. Katie had just claimed him as family, and he realized that somewhere in the past day he had claimed her too. Buck shouldered his pack and took Katie's hand. They slipped out the back door just as heavy footsteps stomped onto the front porch. The wind covered the sound of their escape as they made their way toward the tree line, 2 small figures disappearing into the vast white wilderness. Behind them, The marshals pounded on the cabin door, their shouts lost in the howling storm. But Buck and Katie were already ghosts, vanishing into the Montana mountains with nothing but each other and the fierce determination to stay together. The hunt had begun. The old trapper's cabin sat in a hollow between two ridges, so hidden by pine trees and fallen logs that a man could walk within 50 feet of it and never know it was there. Buck had discovered it years ago during a hunting trip and filed the location away in his memory. One never knew when such knowledge might prove useful. Now, as he pushed open the warped wooden door, he was grateful for that long-ago discovery. The cabin was smaller than his own, just one room with a stone fireplace and a single window, but it was solid and dry. More importantly, it was invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Katie followed him inside, stamping snow from her boots and looking around with the same careful attention she'd shown at his cabin. Buck's father's compass hung heavy in his pocket, a brass instrument that had guided 3 generations of Rawlings men through uncertain territory. Tonight, it had led them to safety. "It's not much," Buck said, setting down his pack and moving to examine the fireplace, "but it'll keep us warm and dry." "It's perfect," Katie said simply, and Buck marveled again at her ability to find contentment in the most basic shelter. The cabin had been abandoned for years, but some previous occupant had left behind a few essential items: cooking pots, a pile of old blankets, some rusty tools. Buck quickly set about building a fire while Katie explored their temporary home with quiet efficiency. "Papa Buck," she said, the title coming more naturally now. "There's a root cellar under the floor. It's got some canned goods." Buck felt a surge of hope. Food was their most pressing concern, and any supplies they could find would extend their ability to stay hidden. He pried up the loose floorboards Katie had discovered and found a small cache of preserved foods, beans, dried meat, even some fruit that had somehow survived the years. "Looks like someone else had the same idea we did," Buck observed. "Probably used this place as a hideout during hard times." As they prepared a simple meal over the fire, Buck began teaching Katie the skills she'd need to survive in the wilderness. How to read the wind to predict weather changes. How to build a fire that wouldn't smoke and give away their position. How to listen for the sounds that meant danger. Horses approaching, men's voices, the particular quiet that meant predators were near. Katie absorbed everything with remarkable focus. When Buck showed her how to prepare kindling, she practiced until her small fingers could split wood chips with the precision of someone much older. When he explained how to bank a fire for the night, she repeated his instructions back to him. "Word for word. You're a quick learner," Buck said approvingly. "Mama always said I had to pay attention to everything," Katie replied. "She said someday it might save my life." Buck's chest tightened. Katie's mother had been wiser than she knew. As the days passed, they developed routines that gave structure to their uncertain existence. Buck would rise before dawn to scout the area for signs of pursuit, while Katie tended the fire and prepared breakfast. During the day, Buck taught her to read tracks in the snow, deer, rabbit, even the occasional wolf print. Katie proved to have sharp eyes and steady hands, qualities that served her well when Buck began teaching her to set snares for small game. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire while Buck read aloud from Martha's journal. Katie was fascinated by the stories of Buck and Martha's early years together, their struggles to build a life in the wilderness, their dreams for the future. "She sounds like she was brave," Katie said one night after Buck had read about Martha, nursing him through a bout of pneumonia during their first winter. "She was the bravest person I ever knew," Buck agreed. "She gave up a comfortable life in the city to follow me out here. Never complained, not once." "Do you miss her?" Buck stared into the fire for a long moment. "Every day. But having you here, it helps. Martha always wanted children around. She would have loved you." Katie snuggled closer to Buck's side. "I think she sent you to find me, like an angel." The simple faith in her words made Buck's throat burn. He'd stopped believing in angels years ago, but looking at Katie's peaceful face in the firelight, he wondered if maybe he'd been wrong. On their fourth day in the cabin, their peaceful routine was shattered. Buck had ventured out at dawn to check their snares when he spotted movement on the ridge above. 3 riders picking their way carefully through the snow. Even at a distance, he could see they wore the dark coats of federal officers. Buck's blood ran cold. He moved quickly but quietly back to the cabin, where Katie was warming leftover beans for breakfast. "We've got company," he said tersely, already reaching for his pack. Katie didn't waste time with questions. She began gathering their few possessions with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes meant moving fast. Buck marveled at her composure. Most adults would be panicking, but Katie simply did what needed to be done. They slipped out the back of the cabin just as the riders reached the clearing in front. Buck led Katie up a steep game trail that switchbacked through dense timber, their feet silent on the snow-covered ground. Behind them, he could hear the marshals' voices as they searched the cabin. The climb was brutal. The trail was barely wide enough for one person, and the altitude made every breath burn in their lungs. Katie struggled with the pace, her short legs working twice as hard as Buck's to cover the same ground, but she never complained or asked to rest. Halfway up the ridge, disaster struck. Buck's foot hit a patch of ice hidden beneath loose snow, and he went down hard, his ankle twisting beneath him with a sickening pop. Pain shot up his leg like fire, and when he tried to stand, the joint wouldn't support his weight. "Papa Buck!" Katie was at his side instantly, her small hands reaching to help him. Buck gritted his teeth against the pain and tried to assess their situation. The ankle was badly sprained, possibly broken. He could hear the marshals below getting closer as they followed their trail through the snow. In his current condition, he'd slow Katie down, make them both easy targets. "Katie," he said, his voice tight with pain and desperation, "you need to listen to me very carefully." She knelt beside him in the snow, her eyes wide but steady. "What do I do?" "There's a cave about a quarter-mile up this trail, big enough for both of us, hidden behind a fallen tree. You need to get there and wait for me. I'm not leaving you." Buck's heart swelled with pride and fear in equal measure. "You're not leaving me. You're saving us both. I need you to go ahead, find that cave, and get a fire started. Can you do that?" Katie looked up the trail, then back at Buck's pale, pain-drawn face. She was only 6 years old, alone in the wilderness with federal marshals closing in, but Buck saw something in her expression that made him believe they might actually survive this. "I can do it," she said firmly, "but you have to promise you'll come find me." "I promise." Katie helped Buck fashion a makeshift crutch from a fallen branch, then gathered both their packs, a load that was almost as big as she was. Without a word, she started up the trail, moving with purpose and determination that belied her years. Buck watched her disappear into the trees, then began his own painful journey upward. Each step sent lightning bolts of agony through his ankle, but he forced himself to keep moving. Katie was counting on him, and he wouldn't let her down. Below them, the voices of the marshals grew fainter as they lost the trail in the rocky terrain. Buck smiled grimly through his pain. They'd escaped again, but this time it was Katie who'd saved them both. The music box was small and delicate. Its painted roses faded, but still beautiful in the lamplight. Katie had found it tucked away in the corner of an abandoned store in the mining settlement of Copper Creek, and when she wound the tiny key, it played a haunting melody that reminded Buck of Martha's lullabies. They'd been in Copper Creek for 2 weeks now, guests of Jim Hartwell and his family. The settlement was more alive than Buck had expected, about 40 people clinging to the hope that the played-out mine might yield one more strike. Most were families like the Hartwells, good people who worked hard and looked out for each other. Katie sat on the floor of the Hartwell cabin, the music box in her lap, while 3-year-old Molly Hartwell watched with fascination. At 8, young, Jim Jr. was teaching Katie to play marbles, their quiet voices mixing with the domestic sounds of Mrs. Hartwell preparing supper. Buck watched from his chair by the fire, his injured ankle propped on a stool. Doc Henley had been right. The ankle wasn't broken, but the sprain was severe enough to keep him hobbled for weeks. The forced rest chafed at him, especially when he saw how Katie bloomed in the company of other children. "She's a special child," said Jim Hartwell, settling into the chair beside Buck. Jim was a weathered man in his 40s, with the permanent stoop of someone who'd spent his life bent over in mine shafts. His hands were scarred from years of handling pickaxes and dynamite, but they were gentle when he touched his own children. "That she is," Buck agreed, watching Katie help little Molly wind the music box. "Mary thinks Katie's been through more than any child should have to bear," Jim continued, lowering his voice. "The way she flinches when men raise their voices, how she hoards food like she's not sure where her next meal's coming from." Buck's jaw tightened. He'd noticed the same things: Katie's hypervigilance, her tendency to eat quickly, as if someone might take her food away, the way she sometimes woke in the night with silent tears on her cheeks. "She's safe now," Buck said firmly. "I believe that, but Buck," Jim's expression grew troubled. "We had visitors yesterday while you were resting. Federal marshals asking questions about a missing child." Buck's blood chilled. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, because there was nothing to tell. Haven't seen any missing children around here." Jim's eyes met Buck's steadily. "But they're not giving up. They'll be back." That evening, after the Hartwell children had been put to bed, Buck found himself alone with Katie on the cabin's small porch. The music box sat between them, its melody drifting across the settlement's quiet streets. "Katie," Buck said carefully, "what do you remember about the place where you lived before? The orphanage." Katie's hands stilled on the music box. "I remember being hungry and cold, and the man with the mean eyes who said we were worthless. What about the other children? Were there many of you?" 27 when I left. But Jenny was dead, so maybe 26. Katie's matter-of-fact tone broke Buck's heart. "Some of the older girls got taken to the pretty houses. They never came back." Buck forced himself to stay calm, though rage burned in his chest. "Katie, did anyone ever hurt you? Besides being mean, I mean. Did anyone touch you in ways that felt wrong?" Katie considered this seriously. "Mr. Grimsby hit us with a stick when we were bad, and he made us work in the laundry until our hands bled. But he saved the worst things for the older girls. I was too little," Jenny said. Thank God for small mercies, Buck thought, but the fact that Katie had been spared the worst abuse only because of her age made him sick. "Papa Buck?" Katie's voice was very small. "Are you going to get tired of taking care of me?" The question hit Buck like a physical blow. "What makes you ask that? The people at the orphanage said nobody would ever want me. They said I was too much trouble, that I ate too much food and asked too many questions." Buck turned to face Katie, fully, his hands gentle on her small shoulders. "Listen to me very carefully. You're not too much trouble. You don't eat too much. And there's no such thing as too many questions from a smart little girl who wants to learn about the world." Katie's eyes searched his face. "Really? Really? You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. And if anyone ever tells you different, you come find me and I'll set them straight." Katie smiled then, the real smile that transformed her entire face. She wound the music box again, and they sat listening to its delicate melody while the stars came out overhead. Their peace was shattered 3 days later. Buck woke before dawn to find Jim Hartwell shaking his shoulder urgently. "Buck, we've got trouble. Riders coming up the valley. Looks like those marshals are back and they brought friends." Buck struggled to his feet, his ankle still tender but supporting his weight. Through the window, he could see torches moving up the mountain road, like fireflies in the pre-dawn darkness. "How many?" Buck asked, reaching for his gun belt. 6, maybe 8. They'll be here within the hour." Buck's mind raced. With his ankle still weak, running wasn't an option. But maybe it was time to stop running anyway. Maybe it was time to make a stand. Katie appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and clutching her doll and the music box. She'd learned to sleep. Light and wake ready to move, another survival skill no child should need to master. "Papa Buck," she said quietly, "are the bad men coming?" Buck knelt to her level, his decision crystallizing. "Yes, sweetheart, they're coming. But this time, we're not running. What are we going to do?" Buck looked around the cabin at the Hartwell family, Jim and Mary, young Jim Jr. and little Molly, all of them innocent people who'd shown kindness to strangers. They didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of Katie's situation. "We're going to face them," Buck said. "But first we need to make sure you're safe." Mary Hartwell stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "She can hide in the mine shaft. There's passages down there that go back for miles. Even if they search, they'll never find her." Katie shook her head. "I won't leave Papa Buck. We stay together." "Katie," Buck began. "No!" Katie's voice was sharp with panic. "Everyone I ever loved left me or died. I won't lose you too." The raw pain in her voice stopped Buck cold. He realized that Katie's greatest fear wasn't the marshals or even being taken back to the orphanage. It was being abandoned again by someone she'd learned to trust. "All right," Buck said quietly. "We stay together. But Katie, you have to promise me something. If I tell you to run, you run. If I tell you to hide, you hide. Can you promise me that?" Katie nodded solemnly. "I promise." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats was getting closer. Buck checked his rifle and moved to the window. Katie pressed close against his side. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. A broken-down cowboy and a little girl who'd learned too young that the world could be cruel, but who'd also learned that sometimes, just sometimes, it could offer unexpected grace. The music. Box played its gentle melody one last time, before Katie carefully packed it away. Then they waited for whatever dawn would bring. The photograph was creased and faded, but Buck could still make out Thomas's 7-year-old face beaming up at him from beside a freshly caught trout. They'd been fishing at the lake behind their cabin, and Martha had insisted on capturing the moment with her father's old camera. Thomas had been so proud of that fish, chattering excitedly about how they'd cook it for dinner and save the biggest piece for Mama. Buck tucked the photograph back into his wallet as he watched the federal marshals ride away from Copper Creek empty-handed. The confrontation had been tense but brief. Jim Hartwell and the other miners had closed ranks around Buck and Katie, claiming they'd never seen a missing child. The marshals had searched the settlement thoroughly but found nothing. "You belong with us," Katie had whispered to Buck as they hid in the depths of the mine shaft. "We're family now." Those words echoed in Buck's mind as they made their way higher into the mountains, seeking sanctuary in a world where the law's reach grew thin, and a man could disappear entirely if he knew the land well enough. Katie rode behind him on his horse, her small arms wrapped around his waist, the music box safely tucked in his saddlebags. The abandoned cabin they found was a relic from the gold rush days, built by some optimistic prospector who'd probably died alone in these mountains 30 years ago. It sat on a ledge overlooking a valley so remote that Buck doubted human eyes had seen it in a decade. More importantly, it was stocked with supplies, canned goods, flour, even a few books left behind by the previous occupant. "It's like someone knew we were coming," Katie said as they explored their new refuge. Buck hoped she was right. They would need every advantage they could get. The first few days were peaceful. Buck's ankle had healed enough to allow him short walks around their perimeter, checking for signs of pursuit. Katie helped organize their supplies with the methodical care of someone who'd learned not to waste anything. In the evenings, they sat by the fire while Buck taught her to read from the books they'd found. It was during one of these quiet lessons that Katie fell ill. At first, it seemed like nothing more than fatigue from their long journey. But by the third day, Katie was burning with fever, her small body shaking with chills despite the warm fire. Buck's hands trembled as he felt her forehead. She was dangerously hot. "Papa Buck," Katie whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't feel good." Buck's world narrowed to the essential task of keeping Katie alive. He used every remedy he knew, cool compresses for the fever, willow bark tea for the pain, constant vigilance through the long nights when her breathing grew shallow and labored. For 3 days, Katy drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her dead mother, sometimes reaching for Buck with desperate need. During the worst of it, when Katy's fever spiked so high that Buck feared she might die in his arms, she called him something that stopped his heart. "Papa," she whispered, not Papa Buck, but just Papa, the simple word of a child claiming her father. Buck sat beside her makeshift bed, holding her burning hand in his weathered ones, and made a promise to whatever powers might be listening. If Katy lived, he would never let anything hurt her again. He would be the father she needed, the protector she deserved, even if it cost him everything. On the 4th morning, Katy's fever finally broke. Buck woke to find her sitting up in bed, pale and weak but lucid, asking for water in a voice that was barely a whisper, but was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. "You came back," Buck said, his voice rough with emotion. "Did you think I'd leave you?" Katy asked with a small smile. Buck laughed through his tears. "Never again, sweetheart. We're stuck with each other now." As Katy recovered her strength, Buck read to her from one of the books they'd found, a collection of frontier tales that seemed appropriate for their circumstances. Katy was fascinated by the stories of brave pioneers and hardy settlers, people who'd faced impossible odds and somehow prevailed. "Were you scared when you were little?" Katy asked one evening as they shared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. Buck considered the question seriously. "Plenty of times. I was scared when my pa died and left me to run the farm alone. I was scared when I asked your Mama Martha to marry me, afraid she'd say no. I was scared when Thomas was born, wondering if I'd be a good father." "Were you a good father?" The question cut deep. Buck thought about Thomas, about the angry words that had driven his son away, about all the ways he'd failed as a parent. "I tried to be, but I made mistakes, big ones." Katy nodded thoughtfully. "Mama used to say that making mistakes doesn't make you bad, it just makes you human." The wisdom of it, coming from someone so young, humbled Buck completely. Their peaceful recovery was interrupted on Katy's 6th day of convalescence. Buck was outside gathering firewood when he heard it, the distant howl of wolves echoing through the valley. He froze, listening carefully, and heard the sound again, closer this time. Wolves weren't uncommon in these mountains, but they usually avoided human settlements. For them to be this bold meant they were either very hungry or very desperate. Buck hurried back to the cabin where Katy was sitting by the fire with one of her books. "We might have visitors tonight," Buck said, checking his rifle and making sure he had plenty of ammunition. Katy looked up from her book. "What kind of visitors?" "The 4-legged kind with sharp teeth." Katy's eyes widened, but she didn't panic. "What do? We keep the fire burning bright and stay inside. Wolves are smart. They usually won't attack if they think the odds are against them." As darkness fell, the howling grew closer. Buck could see shapes moving in the trees beyond the firelight, grey shadows that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. He kept his rifle ready and added more wood to the fire, creating a barrier of light around their small refuge. Katy sat calmly beside him, her doll in her lap, showing no fear despite the danger surrounding them. "Papa," she said quietly, "if something happens to you, what should I do?" Buck's throat tightened. "Nothing's going to happen to me, but if it does." Buck looked at this brave little girl who'd already survived more hardship than most adults would face in a lifetime. "If something happens to me, you do whatever you have to do to survive. You're stronger than you know, Katy, stronger than anyone has a right to be at 6 years old." The wolves circled their cabin for hours, testing their defenses, looking for weakness. But the fire held them at bay, and eventually the pack moved on in search of easier prey. As dawn broke over the mountains, Buck realized something had shifted between him and Katy during the long night. She'd stopped looking to him for reassurance and had started drawing strength from her own reserves of courage. And he'd stopped seeing her as a burden to be protected and started seeing her as a partner in their survival. "We make a good team," Katy said, as they watched the sun rise over the valley. Buck smiled and pulled her close. "The best," he agreed. And for the first time since Martha's death, he felt like he might actually be good at this parenting business, after all. Martha's wedding ring caught the firelight as Buck turned it over in his weathered palm. The simple gold band had lived in his pocket for 5 years now, too precious to leave behind, but too painful to look at most days. Tonight, as spring's first warm breeze stirred the mountain air, he found himself thinking about what the ring represented, not just love lost, but love given freely, without reservation. Katie sat across from him, braiding wildflowers into a crown with the focused concentration she brought to everything. Spring had transformed their mountain refuge from a frozen wasteland into something approaching paradise. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the streams ran full with snowmelt. More importantly, the warming weather meant easier travel for both them and their pursuers. "Papa," Katie said, not looking up from her flowers, "do you think Mama Martha would have liked me?" Buck's throat tightened. "She would have loved you, sweetheart. She always wanted a daughter to teach things to, how to braid hair, how to cook, how to be strong and kind at the same time. I wish I could have met her." "Me too." Buck slipped the ring back into his pocket. "But you know what? I think she did send someone to help us." Before Katie could ask what he meant, the sound of an approaching horse made them both freeze. Buck reached for his rifle, then relaxed as he recognized the rider, a traveling preacher named Samuel who made regular circuits through the mountain settlements. Buck had encountered him before and found him to be a good man, the kind who judged by actions rather than circumstances. "Evening, Brother Rawlings," Samuel called as he dismounted. He was a tall, lean man with kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that put people at ease. "And who might this young lady be?" "This is Katie," Buck said carefully. "My daughter." Samuel's eyes showed no surprise at the obvious fiction, but he nodded gravely to Katie. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Katie. That's a beautiful flower crown you're making." Katie beamed under the praise. "Would you like to stay for supper? Papa made rabbit stew." "I'd be honored." Over the simple meal, Samuel spoke of his travels through the mountains, the families he'd visited, the children he'd baptized, and the couples he'd married. He had a gift for storytelling that kept Katie enthralled, and Buck found himself relaxing for the first time in weeks. "You know," Samuel said as they sat around the fire after dinner, "I've been thinking about the nature of family lately. Seems to me that blood doesn't always make a family, and the lack of it doesn't prevent one either." Buck met the preacher's knowing gaze. "What makes a family, then?" "Love. Commitment. The choice to stand by someone no matter what the world throws at you." Samuel's eyes moved to Katie, who was drowsing against Buck's shoulder. "Some of the strongest families I know were born of choice rather than blood." "What about the law?" Buck asked quietly. "The law serves justice, and justice serves love. Sometimes they align and sometimes they don't. When they don't, a man has to choose which master he'll serve." The preacher's words stayed with Buck long after Samuel had ridden away the next morning. They crystallized something Buck had been feeling but couldn't articulate, that his relationship with Katie transcended legal definitions or social conventions. She was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he was her father by choice and devotion, if not by blood. That afternoon brought news that shattered their mountain peace. A rider arrived at their cabin, young Jim Jr. from Copper Creek, his face flushed from hard riding. "Mr. Buck," the boy called out as he dismounted, "Pa sent me to warn you. Your son's been asking around town about you. Says he's looking to make things right." Buck's world tilted. Thomas, after more than 10 years of silence, his son was searching for him. Buck's emotions warred between hope and terror. Hope that perhaps they could heal the wounds between them. Terror that Thomas's arrival might endanger Katie. "What did he look like?" Buck asked. "Tall like you, but thinner. Brown hair, nice clothes. Had papers with him, legal documents of some kind. Pa said he seemed like quality folk." Buck's mind raced. Legal documents could mean anything. A will, business papers, or something more ominous. Was Thomas working with the authorities? Had he come to turn Buck in or to help? "Where is he now?" Buck asked. Left Copper Creek yesterday, heading up toward the high country. Pa thinks he's following the same trail you took." Buck felt Katie's small hand slip into his. She'd been listening with the intense focus she brought to any conversation that might affect their future together. "Is your son a good man?" Katie asked simply. Buck considered the question. The Thomas he'd known had been proud, stubborn, quick to anger, traits he'd inherited from Buck himself. But underneath it all, he'd been fundamentally decent, with a strong sense of right and wrong. "I think so," Buck said honestly. "But I don't know what kind of man he's become." "Then we wait and see," Katie said with the practical wisdom that never failed to amaze Buck. They didn't have to wait long. Thomas arrived the next evening, riding alone and empty-handed except for a leather satchel. Buck watched from the cabin window as his son dismounted, noting how Thomas had filled out since Buck had last seen him. He was a man now, not the angry 18-year-old who'd stormed away from their last argument. Buck stepped onto the cabin porch, Katie beside him, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Father and son faced each other across 20 feet of mountain meadow and 10 years of silence. "Hello, Pa," Thomas said quietly. "Thomas." Buck's voice was carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you again." "I know. I wouldn't blame you if you sent me away." Thomas's eyes moved to Katie, and Buck saw surprise and something else, understanding, perhaps even approval. "But I have something important to tell you. Something that changes everything." Katie stepped forward slightly, her chin raised with quiet dignity. "Are you going to hurt Papa Buck?" Thomas's expression softened. "No, little one. I'm here to help him, to help both of you." Buck felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Whatever Thomas had become in the years since their estrangement, he was still capable of gentleness with children. "What's in the satchel?" Buck asked. Thomas held up the leather bag. "Legal papers. Adoption documents. I've been working with a lawyer in Denver trying to find a way to make Katie legally yours before the federal marshals track you down." Buck's world tilted again. "You know about—" "I know everything. The orphanage, the escape, the manhunt. I also know you're innocent of everything except protecting a child who needed protection." Katie moved closer to Buck, her small hand gripping his with fierce possessiveness. "Papa Buck is my real papa now. Nobody can take me away from him." Thomas knelt to Katie's level, his voice gentle. "That's exactly what I'm trying to make sure of, Katie. I want to help make it so no one can ever separate you and Pa again." Buck stared at his son, this man who'd once accused him of caring more about his grief than his family, who'd blamed Buck for Martha's death, who'd sworn never to speak to him again. Now, Thomas was risking his own safety to help Buck protect a child he barely knew. "Why?" Buck asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Thomas stood slowly, meeting his father's eyes. "Because I finally understand what you tried to teach me all those years ago. That family isn't about being perfect. It's about being there when it matters most." The distance between them seemed to shrink, though neither man moved. Katie looked back and forth between them, sensing the weight of the moment. "Besides," Thomas added with a slight smile, "I always wanted a little sister." And just like that, the wall that had stood between Buck and Thomas for 10 years began to crumble, not all at once, but slowly, like snow melting in spring sunshine. The legal document was written in the formal language of territorial law, but its meaning was crystal clear, a petition for adoption that would make Catherine Brennan into Catherine Rawlings, legally and permanently. Thomas had thought of everything, even including affidavits from Doc Henley and several Copper Creek residents testifying to Buck's character and Katie's well-being under his care. Buck read through the papers by lamplight, while Katie slept peacefully in the cabin's single bed, her doll tucked securely in her arms. Thomas sat across from him, nervously cleaning his glasses, a habit Buck remembered from his son's childhood. "This is incredible work," Buck said finally. "Must have cost you a fortune in legal fees." "Worth every penny." Thomas replaced his glasses and met his father's eyes. "Though I should tell you, getting it approved won't be easy. The territorial judge has to sign off on it, and with federal marshals involved, They'll fight it, probably, but we have one advantage they don't expect. Buck raised an eyebrow. Which is? Thomas pulled another document from his satchel, this one bearing an official government seal. A presidential pardon. Turns out President Grant isn't too fond of corrupt territorial officials, especially ones who traffic in children. Buck stared at the document in disbelief. How in the hell did you manage this? I may have spent some time in Washington making the right connections. Amazing how much attention a mining scandal gets when it involves federal oversight failures and missing children. The full scope of what Thomas had accomplished was staggering. While Buck had been running through the mountains with Katie, his son had been waging a legal war in courtrooms and government offices, building a case that could free them both. But the most important question remained unasked. Buck set down the papers and studied his son's face in the lamplight. Thomas, I need to know something. Why are you doing this after everything that happened between us? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of reflection and regret. Do you remember the last thing you said to me before I left? Buck's chest tightened. He remembered every word of that awful fight, the accusations hurled in grief and anger. I said a lot of things I shouldn't have. You said that someday I'd understand what it meant to love someone more than my own life. You said I'd understand why you couldn't just get over losing Ma, why her death broke something in you that wouldn't heal. Buck nodded, the memory still painful after all these years. I was so angry, Thomas continued, angry at you for withdrawing from me when I needed you most, angry at Ma for dying, angry at God for taking her. I thought you were just wallowing in self-pity. Maybe I was. No. Thomas's voice was firm. I've had 10 years to think about it, and I understand now. You weren't wallowing, you were drowning, and instead of throwing you a rope, I pushed you deeper underwater. The admission hung between them like a bridge finally built across a long chasm. Buck felt tears prick his eyes, but he didn't look away from his son's face. I met someone, Thomas said quietly. A woman named Rebecca in Denver. We're engaged to be married next spring. And when I realized how much I loved her, how lost I'd be if something happened to her, I finally understood what losing Ma did to you. Buck's throat burned. I failed you, son. After she died, I was so caught up in my own pain that I couldn't see yours. We both failed each other, but maybe it's not too late to get it right. Katie stirred in her sleep, murmuring something Buck couldn't quite make out. Both men looked toward the bed, their attention drawn to this small person who had somehow brought them back together. She's remarkable, Thomas said softly. The way she looks at you, the way she talks about you. Pa, she loves you completely. No reservations, no conditions, just pure trust and devotion. She saved my life, Buck said simply. I was dying inside before I found her. Didn't even realize it until I had someone to live for again. That's what I mean. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense. That's the man I remember from when I was little. The father who taught me to fish and ride, who read me stories and made me feel like I could conquer the world. Katie brought him back. Buck wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I want to be that man again. For her, and maybe for you too, if you'll let me. I'd like that, Pa. I'd like that very much. They talked through the night, filling in the gaps of 10 lost years. Thomas told Buck about his work in Denver, his plans for marriage, the law practice he'd built. From nothing. Buck shared stories of his life in the mountains, his friendship with the people of Copper Creek, and the slow healing that Katie's presence had brought to his wounded soul. As dawn approached, they began planning their next move. The adoption papers needed to be filed in the territorial capital, but doing so would expose them to the very authorities hunting them. It's a risk, Thomas admitted, but staying hidden forever isn't an option. Katie needs a real life, school, friends, a future that isn't built on running and hiding. What if the judge refuses to hear the case? Then we go to federal court. I've got contacts in Washington who are very interested in seeing the Millfield orphanage situation resolved. One way or another, we're going to make this legal. Katie woke to find Buck and Thomas planning over coffee and maps. She emerged from the bed like a small, tousled bird, clutching her doll and blinking in the morning light. "Good morning, sweetheart," Buck said, opening his arms. Katie came to him immediately, settling on his lap with the easy trust that never failed to humble him. "Are you and Thomas friends now?" she asked, studying Thomas with curious eyes. "We're working on it," Buck said. "What do you think about having a big brother?" Katie considered this seriously. "Will he teach me things and help take care of Papa? Buck, when he gets old?" Thomas laughed, the first genuine laugh Buck had heard from him since his arrival. "I think I can manage that." "Then I think it's a good idea," Katie declared. "Families should stick together." The simple wisdom of it made both men smile. This child, who had known abandonment and abuse, still believed in the power of family bonds. She was teaching them both something essential about forgiveness and love. "Katie," Thomas said gently, "how would you feel about taking a trip to the territorial capital? It's a big city with lots of people and buildings. We need to go there to make sure Papa Buck can be your real papa forever." Katie's grip on Buck tightened slightly. "Will the bad men be there?" "Some of them might be," Buck said honestly. "But Thomas has papers that say we're not breaking any laws. And we'll all be together. You, me, and Thomas. Like a real family?" "Like a real family," Thomas confirmed. Katie nodded decisively. "Then let's go. I want everyone to know that Papa Buck belongs to me and I belong to him." Buck hugged her close, marveling at her courage. This little girl who had fled through blizzards and hidden in mine shafts was ready to walk into a courtroom and claim her place in the world. As they prepared to leave their mountain sanctuary, Buck caught Thomas watching him and Katie with an expression of wonder. "What is it?" Buck asked. "I was just thinking," Thomas said. 10 years ago, I left here thinking you were a broken man who had nothing left to give. But looking at you with Katie, you're the best father I've ever seen." Buck's eyes misted. "I had a good teacher. Your mother showed me what it meant to love someone completely, and you showed me what it meant to fight for the people you love, even when the odds are against you." "We all did," Katie added, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that was uniquely hers. "We're a family, and families take care of each other." As they rode down from the mountains toward an uncertain future, Buck realized that Katie was right. They were a family, not by blood, but by choice, commitment, and love. And maybe that was the strongest kind of family there was. The train ticket was made of heavy cardstock, its bold lettering announcing passage from Helena to the territorial capital of Virginia City. Buck held it carefully, knowing it represented their passage to either freedom or capture. The locomotive sat at the platform like a sleeping dragon, steam rising from its boiler in the crisp morning air. "All aboard!" the conductor called, his voice echoing across the crowded platform. Helena was the largest town Buck had seen in years, a bustling hub of commerce and territorial government that made him feel exposed and vulnerable. Katie stood between Buck and Thomas, wearing a new blue dress that Thomas had bought for her in town. Her hair was neatly braided and tied with ribbons, and she carried a small traveling bag that contained her few precious possessions. Her doll, the music box from Copper Creek, and a letter Buck had written documenting their journey together. "Remember what we talked about," Thomas said quietly as they climbed aboard the train. "You're a respectable rancher traveling with your daughter and son. Katie's been living with you since her parents died. Keep it simple." Buck nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation, obtaining proper clothes, forged travel documents, and coaching Katie on what to say if anyone questioned their relationship. Thomas had thought of everything, but Buck couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The train car was comfortable but crowded, filled with territorial officials, mining executives, and families traveling to the capital for various reasons. Buck chose seats near the back, where they could watch other passengers, while keeping Katie between him and the window. As the train pulled away from Helena, Buck watched the mountains recede behind them and felt a pang of loss. Those peaks had been his refuge for months, the place where he and Katie had learned to be a family. Now they were heading into the heart of territorial authority, where their fate would be decided by strangers in a courtroom. "Papa," Katie whispered, tugging on his sleeve, "that man is staring at us." Buck followed her gaze to a well-dressed gentleman 3 rows ahead who kept glancing back in their direction. The man had the alert, predatory look of someone accustomed to hunting other people. "Federal Marshal," Thomas murmured under his breath. "I recognize him from Denver. His name's Patterson." Buck's hand moved instinctively toward the gun hidden beneath his coat, but Thomas caught his wrist. "Easy, Pa. He's just suspicious, not certain. If we act normal, we'll be fine." The remainder of the train ride passed in tense silence. Katie dozed against Buck's shoulder, while Thomas read a newspaper, both of them maintaining the facade of a family on an ordinary journey. But Buck could feel Patterson's eyes on them like a physical weight, and he knew their troubles were just beginning. Virginia City was everything Buck had expected and feared. A sprawling metropolis of brick buildings, crowded streets, and constant noise. The territorial courthouse sat at the center of town like a fortress, its imposing columns and granite steps designed to intimidate anyone who dared challenge the law. Thomas had arranged lodging at a modest hotel near the courthouse, chosen specifically for its respectability and its location away from the seedier parts of town where federal agents might be watching. Their rooms were clean and comfortable, but Buck felt trapped by the walls and windows, accustomed as he'd become to the freedom of open spaces. "The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Thomas explained as they settled into Buck's room. "Judge Harrison is presiding. He's got a reputation for fairness, but he's also a stickler for proper procedure." "What about the opposition?" "Director Grimsby from the Millfield Orphanage will be there, along with his lawyers. They'll argue that Katie is a ward of the territorial government, and that you're an unfit guardian who kidnapped her." Buck's jaw tightened. "And what do we argue? That you saved her from an abusive situation and provided the loving home she desperately needed. We have testimonials from Doc Henley, the Hartwells, even Preacher Samuel. We have evidence of corruption at Millfield, and we have the presidential pardon for any technical violations of territorial law." Katie looked up from where she'd been arranging her belongings on the bed. "What if they don't believe us?" Thomas knelt to her level, his expression gentle but honest. "Then we keep fighting until they do. Sometimes doing the right thing takes more than one try." That evening, Buck walked the streets of Virginia City with Katie, both of them needing air and space after the confines of the train and hotel. The town was alive with activity: saloons, restaurants, shops selling everything from mining equipment to fancy dresses. They stopped at a small park where Katie fed breadcrumbs to a flock of pigeons while Buck watched the people around them. Families strolled together, children played on the grass, couples walked arm in arm. It was the kind of normal life Buck wanted for Katie, safe, predictable, full of simple pleasures. "Papa," Katie said as they sat on a bench watching the sunset, "are you scared about tomorrow?" Buck considered lying, then decided Katie deserved the truth. "A little, but mostly I'm hopeful. We've come this far together, and I believe we're going to make it the rest of the way. Even if the judge says no, even then, because no matter what any court says, you're my daughter and I'm your father, that won't change." Katie smiled and took his hand. "Good, because I don't want any other papa." They returned to the hotel to find Thomas pacing their room like a caged animal, his usually calm demeanor cracked with worry. "What's wrong?" Buck asked immediately. "I've been asking around about our opposition. Grimsby isn't just bringing lawyers. Tomorrow, he's bringing federal marshals, territorial officials, even a representative from the California family that was supposed to adopt Katie." Buck's blood chilled. "How many people are we facing?" "Too many. And there's something else." Thomas pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This was slipped under my door an hour ago. Buck read the note with growing alarm. It was a warning from an anonymous source, claiming that Grimsby had bribed courthouse officials and that the hearing was rigged against them. The note advised them to flee while they still could. Could be a trap, Buck said, though something in his gut told him the warning was genuine. Or it could be our only chance to save Katie. Thomas ran his hands through his hair. Pa, what if we're wrong about this? What if we can't prove the corruption? What if they take her away? For the first time since Buck had known him, Thomas looked truly frightened. The confident lawyer who'd orchestrated their legal strategy was facing the possibility that his carefully laid plans might not be enough. Buck looked at Katie, who was listening to their conversation with the serious attention she brought to anything that might affect her future. This brave little girl had already suffered more trauma than any child should endure. The thought of her being dragged back to abuse, or worse, made Buck's vision blur with rage. "We don't run," Buck said firmly. "We've been running for months, and it hasn't solved anything. Tomorrow we stand up in that courtroom and we tell the truth, all of it. And if they don't listen," Buck's hand moved to the gun beneath his coat, "then we make them listen." Thomas paled. "Pa, you can't—" "I won't let them take her." Buck's voice was quiet but implacable. "I've lost too much in my life to lose her too. Whatever it takes, however far I have to go, Katie stays with me." "Papa Buck," Katie said softly, moving to his side. "Remember what Preacher Samuel said? About choosing which master to serve, the law or love?" Buck nodded. "Well, I choose love, I choose you. And if they try to take me away, we'll just have to prove that love is stronger than their old laws." The simple faith in her voice steadied. Buck's resolve. Katie was right. Love was stronger than law, stronger than corruption, stronger than the fear that had been driving them for months. "All right," he said, pulling Katie into his arms. "Tomorrow we go to court. We tell our story, and we let the chips fall where they may." Thomas looked between them, seeing something in their faces that made him straighten his shoulders and lift his chin. "Together?" "Together," Buck confirmed. As they prepared for bed, Buck wrote in Martha's journal for the first time since finding Katie. He wrote about their journey, their love, and his hope that tomorrow would bring justice rather than heartbreak. Outside their window, Virginia City settled into evening quiet, unaware that in one small hotel room a family was preparing to fight for its very existence. Katie fell asleep, holding Buck's hand, her face peaceful despite the uncertainty they faced. Buck watched her sleep and made a silent promise to Martha's memory. He would protect this child with everything he had, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. But tonight, they were still a family, and that was enough. The judge's gavel was carved from dark walnut, its surface worn smooth by years of decisive strikes that had determined the fates of countless individuals. Judge Harrison held it now, with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of the moment, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the packed courtroom. Buck sat at the defendant's table with Thomas and Katie, acutely aware of the hostile eyes focused on them from across the aisle. Director Grimsby was a thin, pale man with cold eyes and the demeanor of someone accustomed to absolute authority over vulnerable people. His lawyers flanked him like well-dressed vultures, their briefcases bulging with documents meant to tear. Katie, away from the only family she'd known, behind Grimsby sat the federal marshals, including Patterson from the train, their presence a not-so-subtle reminder of what would happen if the court ruled against Buck. And in the front row, a well-dressed woman who could only be the representative from the California family, the people who thought they could buy Katie like a commodity. "This court is now in session," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room. "We are here to determine the custody of one Catherine Brennan, currently in the care of Theodore Rawlings. Mr. Prosecutor, you may begin." The territorial prosecutor was a young man eager to make his mark, and he launched into his opening statement with theatrical flourish. He painted Buck as a dangerous outlaw who had kidnapped a helpless child and corrupted her against proper authority. He spoke of territorial law and federal jurisdiction, of the sacred duty to protect orphaned children from predators who would exploit their vulnerability. Buck felt Katie's small hand slip into his under the table. She sat perfectly still, her face composed, despite the terrible things being said about the man she considered her father. Her courage in the face of such hostility made Buck's chest swell with pride and determination. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he rose with quiet dignity and began to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. He presented evidence of corruption at Millfield, testimonials from respected members of the community, and medical reports documenting Katie's improved health under Buck's care. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice clear and strong, "this is not a case about territorial jurisdiction or federal authority. This is about a man who saved a child's life and gave her the loving home she desperately needed. Theodore Rawlings is not a kidnapper. He is a father in every way that matters." But it was what happened next that changed everything. Director Grimsby took the stand to testify about Katie's criminal behavior and Buck's unlawful interference with territorial authority. His testimony was smooth and practiced, designed to portray the orphanage as a benevolent institution wronged by a selfish man's actions. Then Thomas began his cross-examination. "Mr. Grimsby," Thomas said pleasantly, "how many children have died at Millfield during your tenure as director?" Grimsby's composure flickered. "Children in institutional care face many challenges." "That's not what I asked. How many children have died?" "I don't have exact figures." 17, Thomas said, consulting his notes. 17 children in 5 years. "Would you say that's normal for an orphanage?" "We do our best with limited resources. And how many children have been transferred to private placements that you cannot or will not identify?" The courtroom was dead silent now. Grimsby's face had gone white, and his lawyers were frantically shuffling papers. "I don't understand the relevance. The relevance, Mr. Grimsby, is that Catherine Brennan witnessed something at your institution that made her desperate enough to flee into a Montana blizzard rather than remain in your care. What did she see?" "Objection," the prosecutor called, but Judge Harrison waved him silent. "Answer the question, Mr. Grimsby." Grimsby's mask finally slipped completely. "That child is a liar and a troublemaker. She corrupted the other children with wild stories." "What kind of stories?" "She claimed that certain benefactors were inappropriate with the older girls. She made accusations that threatened the very existence of our institution." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison's gavel banged repeatedly as spectators shouted and reporters scribbled frantically. Through it all, Katie sat calmly beside Buck, her hand still in his, watching the man who had terrorized her finally reveal his true nature to the world. When order was restored, Judge Harrison's face was grim. "Mr. Grimsby, are you admitting that children at Millfield were sexually abused and that you knew about it?" "I'm saying that Catherine Brennan was a disruptive influence who needed to be removed to a more suitable environment." "You mean sold," Thomas said quietly. "You were selling children to the highest bidder, weren't you?" "That's enough!" Grimsby snarled, his composure completely shattered. "That brat should be grateful anyone wanted her at all. Do you know what happens to unwanted children? They disappear and nobody cares." The courtroom fell into shocked silence. In his fury, Grimsby had just confessed to everything Buck and Thomas had suspected. Judge Harrison's knuckles were white as he gripped his gavel, and even the federal marshals looked sick. Katie stood up then, small but fierce, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I'm not unwanted," she said clearly. "Papa Buck wants me. I'm his daughter and he's my papa, and nobody can change that." Judge Harrison looked down at this brave little girl who had endured so much and still found the courage to speak her truth. When he raised his gavel, Buck held his breath, knowing that everything they'd fought for hung in the balance of what came next. Buck's family Bible was leather-bound and ancient, its pages yellow with age and filled with the careful script of 3 generations of Rawlings men and women. The family record section at the front documented births, deaths, and marriages going back to Buck's great-grandfather, each entry a testament to the continuity of family bonds across time. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. In the matter of Catherine Brennan, this court finds that the best interests of the child require immediate removal from territorial custody and placement with Theodore Rawlings. The adoption petition is approved. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Buck felt his knees go weak with relief as Katie threw herself into his arms, tears streaming down both their faces. Thomas was grinning like a fool, his careful lawyer's composure finally cracking under the weight of their victory. But their celebration was short-lived. Even as the judge continued speaking about the corruption charges that would be filed against Grimsby and the federal investigation that would follow, Buck saw federal marshals moving toward the exits, blocking any chance of escape. Marshal Patterson stepped forward, his face grim but resolute. "Mr. Rawlings, you're still under arrest for harboring a fugitive and interfering with federal authority." The courtroom fell silent again. Judge Harrison's face darkened with anger. "Marshal Patterson, I've just ruled that Mr. Rawlings acted lawfully in protecting this child. With respect, Your Honor, that ruling only applies to the adoption. The federal charges are separate, and I have my orders." Buck felt Katie's grip tighten around his neck. After everything they'd been through, after their victory in court, he was still going to be taken away from her. The injustice of it made his vision blur with rage. Then Thomas stepped forward, his hand reaching into his coat pocket. "Marshal Patterson, before you proceed, you might want to look at this." He handed Patterson a document with an official government seal, the presidential pardon Buck had seen in the mountains, but hadn't fully understood until now. Patterson's eyes widened as he read. This is signed by President Grant himself. Full pardon for any and all federal crimes committed in the protection of Catherine Brennan. Thomas confirmed. "I spent 3 months in Washington making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed." The marshal looked from the document to Buck to Katie, his face a study in conflicted duty. Finally, he folded the paper and handed it back to Thomas. "Looks like your federal charges just disappeared, Mr. Rawlings." The courtroom erupted again, this time in a celebration that couldn't be contained. Buck lifted Katie high in the air, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, she immediately ran to Thomas and hugged him fiercely. "Thank you for bringing Papa Buck back to me," she said, and Thomas had to wipe his eyes. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order, but he was smiling now. "Mr. Rawlings, Miss Catherine, it's my pleasure to officially declare you father and daughter in the eyes of the law. May you have many happy years together." As they left the courthouse, Buck was amazed by the crowd that had gathered to congratulate them. Doc Henley had made the journey from Cedar Falls, along with the Hartwells and even Mrs. Polk, who pressed a bag of peppermint candy into Katie's hands with tears in her eyes. "We never doubted you'd prevail," Doc Henley said, shaking Buck's hand warmly. "That little girl belongs with you, and now the whole world knows it." But perhaps the most surprising supporter was Preacher Samuel, who had somehow learned of their court date and traveled to Virginia City to witness their victory. "Brother Rawlings," he said, clasping Buck's shoulder, "I told you that love and justice sometimes align. Today, they did so magnificently." That evening, in their hotel room, Buck sat at the small writing desk with his family Bible open before him. Katie watched with fascination as he carefully wrote her name in the family record section, documenting her official adoption with the same care his ancestors had used to record births and marriages. "Catherine Sarah Rawlings," he wrote in his careful script, adding the date and location. "Beloved daughter, age 6 years. Sarah?" Katie asked, looking over his shoulder. "After your mama," Buck explained. "Sarah was her real name. Though everyone called her Katie, I thought you should have that connection to her." Katie traced the letters of her new name with one small finger. "Catherine Sarah Rawlings," she repeated softly. "I like it. It sounds Like I belong somewhere. You belong with us, Thomas said from where he sat near the window. Forever and always. Buck turned to a fresh page and began writing again. Not just Katie's adoption, but the story of how she'd come into their lives. He wrote about finding her in the snow, their months in the mountains, the healing that had taken place between him and Thomas. It was a record for future generations, a testament to the power of love, to create family where none had existed before. What are you writing now? Katie asked. The story of how you saved me, Buck said simply, and how you brought our family back together. Katie climbed onto Buck's lap, careful not to disturb his writing. Are you going to write about the bad men too? Some of it. But mostly I'm writing about the good things, about courage and love and second chances. As Buck wrote, Katie fell asleep in his arms, her head resting against his chest. Thomas moved closer, reading over Buck's shoulder as he documented their extraordinary journey. You know, Thomas said quietly, when I started this legal process, I thought I was just trying to help you and Katie, but somewhere along the way, it became about fixing our family too. Buck paused in his writing and looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in years. Thomas had grown into a fine man, principled and brave, with the kind of integrity that would have made Martha proud. I've missed so much of your life, Buck said, his voice heavy with regret. Then don't miss any more of it. Thomas pulled a photograph from his wallet, a picture of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. I'd like you to meet Rebecca properly when we get back to Denver. She's heard all about you and Katie, and she's excited to meet her new family. Buck studied the photograph, seeing the love in his son's eyes when he looked at it. She's beautiful. When's the wedding? Next spring. And we're hoping you and Katie will come. Rebecca especially wants Katie to be her flower girl. Katie stirred in Buck's arms, mumbling sleepily. Did someone say flower girl? I'd like that very much. Both men laughed, amazed that even in sleep, Katie managed to participate in their conversation. I think that settles it, Buck said, returning to his writing. The Rawlings family will be well represented at your wedding. As the evening progressed, they made plans for their future. Buck and Katie would return to Montana, but not to the isolated cabin where Buck had lived in solitude for so many years. Instead, they would move closer to Cedar Falls, where Katie could attend school and Buck could be part of a community again. Thomas would continue his law practice in Denver, but with frequent visits to Montana. The family that had been broken by grief and misunderstanding was healing, growing stronger through the addition of one small girl who had refused to let them remain apart. You know what the best part is? Katie said, as Buck tucked her into bed. Later that night, what's that, sweetheart? Tomorrow we get to start being a real family. Not hiding, not running, not pretending, just being together like families are supposed to be. Buck kissed her forehead, marveling at her wisdom. You're absolutely right. Tomorrow we start our new life. As Katie drifted off to sleep, Buck returned to his writing in the family Bible. He had years of entries to catch up on, the story of his life with Martha, Thomas's childhood, the dark years after Martha's death, and now the miraculous arrival of Katie. Each entry was a thread in the tapestry of their family history, some proof that love could endure any hardship and overcome any obstacle. When he finished writing, Buck closed the Bible and placed it carefully in Katie's traveling bag. Someday, when she was older, she would understand the full significance of having her name recorded alongside generations of Rawlings. She would know that she truly belonged, not just to Buck, but to a legacy of strong, loving people who had faced adversity with courage and grace. Outside their hotel window, Virginia City was settling into peaceful sleep, unaware that in one small room, a family was finally complete. The hand-carved wooden horse was perfect in every detail, from its flowing mane to its proud stance. Buck had spent weeks working on it in his shop behind their new house in Cedar Falls, each careful cut of his knife guided by love and the desire to create something beautiful for Katie. The horse was painted a rich chestnut brown with white markings, and Katy had named it Thunder after the sound of real horses galloping across the meadow behind their home. 6 months had passed since the courtroom victory in Virginia City, and their new life had settled into the kind of comfortable routine that Buck had never dared hope for again. The house they'd bought was larger than his old mountain cabin, but still modest, a 2-story frame building with a wraparound porch and a view of the mountains that had once been their refuge. Katy had taken to settled life like a flower, finally given proper soil and sunlight. She attended the local school where her quick mind and gentle nature had won over both teachers and classmates. Buck often watched from the kitchen window as she played with other children in their yard, marveling at how she'd learned to be a normal little girl despite everything she'd endured. "Papa Buck!" Katy called now, bursting through the front door with the energy of someone who'd had a particularly good day. "Look what Miss Henderson gave me." She held up a certificate proclaiming her the best reader in her class, her face glowing. With pride, Buck felt his chest swell with the familiar mixture of love and amazement that Katy continued to inspire in him. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said, taking the certificate and examining it with appropriate gravity. "Miss Henderson obviously recognizes talent when she sees it. She said I read better than some of the older children, and she wants me to help teach the younger ones their letters." Buck smiled, remembering how Katy had learned to read during their long winter evenings in mountain hideouts, using Martha's books and the simple joy of discovering stories. Now she was sharing that gift with other children, spreading the light that had always burned bright within her. Thomas arrived that evening, as he did every few weeks when his law practice allowed. These visits had become the highlight of Buck's month, opportunities to strengthen the bond they'd rebuilt and to watch Thomas develop his own relationship with Katy. "Uncle Thomas," Katy threw herself into his arms with the enthusiasm she showed for all her favorite people. "I got a certificate for reading, and Papa Buck made me a horse, and Mrs. Polk said I can help her in the store on Saturdays." Thomas laughed, lifting Katy high in the air. "Slow down there, little scholar, one achievement at a time." Over dinner, they caught up on the week's events. Thomas's law practice was thriving, partly due to the reputation he'd gained from Katy's case. He specialized now in helping families navigate adoption and custody issues, using his experience to ensure other children found the loving homes they deserved. "Rebecca sends her love," Thomas said, pulling out a letter from his fiancée. "She's working on your flower girl dress, Katy. She wants to make sure it's perfect for the wedding." Katy clapped her hands with delight. "Will it have ribbons and maybe some lace?" "I believe both are mentioned specifically in her notes." Buck watched the easy affection between his son and daughter with deep contentment. Thomas had embraced his role as Katy's big brother with enthusiasm, bringing her gifts, telling her stories about his travels, and teaching her things like proper table manners and how to write business letters. After Katy went to bed, Buck and Thomas sat on the front porch with their coffee, enjoying the peaceful evening sounds of their small town. These quiet conversations had become precious to Buck, opportunities to share the daily joys and concerns of fatherhood with someone who understood their unique family dynamics. "She's remarkable," Thomas said, watching through the window as Katy arranged her wooden horse on the shelf beside her other treasures. "I can't imagine our family without her now." "Neither can I," Buck agreed. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd walked past her that night in the snow. But you didn't. That's what matters." Buck pulled Martha's journal from his pocket. He carried it everywhere now, documenting Katy's growth and their family's adventures with the same devotion Martha had shown to recording their early years together. "I wrote to her today," Buck said, opening the journal to his latest entry. "To Martha, I mean. Told her about Katy's certificate and the wooden horse, about how proud she'd be of both our children." Thomas read over Buck's shoulder, seeing how his father had woven memories of Martha throughout Katy's story, creating a bridge between past and present that honored both the love that was lost and the love that had been found. Katie asked me something interesting yesterday, Buck continued. She wanted to know if people in heaven can see what happens on earth. What did you tell her? I told her I believe they can, and that I think Martha sent her to us because she knew we needed each other. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Katie's been good for you, Pa, but you've been good for her too. She was a scared, traumatized little girl when we first met her. Look at her now. Through the window they could see Katie kneeling beside her bed, saying her prayers with the serious concentration. She brought to all important tasks. She'd included everyone she cared about in those prayers: Buck, Thomas, Rebecca, Doc Henley, the Hartwells, even Mrs. Polk and her peppermint candy. She prays for her first mama and papa every night, Buck said quietly, and for all the children, still in bad places, that they'll find good families like she did. She's got a big heart, the biggest. Sometimes I wonder how someone so young can be so wise. Katie finished her prayers and climbed into bed, waving goodnight through the window. Buck waved back, then returned to his journal writing, adding, details about the day's simple pleasures and small triumphs. As the evening wound down and Thomas prepared for bed in the guest room, Buck made his final rounds of the house, checking locks, banking the fire, ensuring Katie was sleeping peacefully. These domestic routines had become sacred to him, tangible proof that their family was safe and secure. Standing in Katie's doorway, watching her sleep with the wooden horse clutched in her arms, Buck reflected on the miraculous journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a bitter, lonely man, convinced that his capacity for love had died with Martha. Now he was a father again, part of a growing family that included not just Katie and Thomas, but Rebecca and all the friends who'd supported them through their struggles. Katie stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like "Papa." Buck smiled and quietly closed her door, his heart full of gratitude for second chances and the transformative power of a child's love. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new joys. But tonight, the Rawlings family was complete, safe and home.